Hi guys. We are SUBSTUDIO. I'm Hannah. We're a small two-person experimental practice. As David said, we met at Cranbrook during our master's studies there. And we're just going to talk about how we structure our work, how we make decisions, and then hopefully what we would like to come out of some of this work in the future. First, we're going to talk about a couple of people who have influenced both of our practices individually and collectively.
So this is Bill Massey. He has been the architect in residence at Cranbrook, meaning department head basically, for 13 years. He left recently. He developed a pedagogy for that school the time that he was there, based in full-scale tool-driven research, and that's something that's really influenced our practice. So his career kind of began with him being a pioneer into digital fabrication, not because of the cool things that it can do, but because it allowed him to be autonomous in his practice and not work in a traditional architecture firm and have a traditional career. So he kind of spent his career trying to outsmart that path. And so he used a CNC as his tool to try to create custom details and actually use it as a way of like building the house instead of just doing, installation or object architecture. He is really his practice has moved beyond the CNC since then, and now is including speculative real estate as a research tool, industrial farming, and he's really into his grass lawn tennis court and talks a lot about lawn mowing robots and things like that. So that he's always on the cusp of something pretty strange.
Yeah.
So these are custom details that he developed in his shop. He always has to have a studio. It's a huge part of his practice.
Yeah. And then this is the work of Heather McGill. She's an artist. She was the head of the Cranbrook sculpture department for the past 25 years. We both have worked as artist assistants for Heather over the past 4 years, actually. So she sort of changed the way that we evaluate color and composition and form. And she, like Bill, works closely with digital machines. So we worked with her primarily on a laser cutter, sort of using the laser as a pencil almost. So learning to draw and have a direct relationship with a tool like a laser cutter. So this is one of her drawings, really perceptually layered and complex. Here's a detail. So we worked with her to develop a lot of drawings and then cut and fabricate these pieces that were all sewn together onto a singular backing plate. So Ingrid.
Hi. So when I began at Cranbrook in 2014, I wanted to develop a set of tools for controlling and manipulating light, kind of taking it from a fascination with like the super layered, hyper complex spaces that successful dance parties can happen in, but thinking through that lens and addressing light art of the 60s, moving all the way up through concert design into the 80s. And 90s. And so in order to get my hands on some of these things, I was playing with, basically developed a material-based practice, so playing with Fresnel lenses, creating lenses of my own using resin and vacuum forming and things like that, and dichroic film. And also like painting and thinking about like water and liquid light and what those can do to manipulate light. And so these things were able to come out of the studio in pretty critical ways. When I did a project, actually collaborating with David Corns, we made this piece that had a really interesting site. It was like 3 feet wide, 60 feet long, and 13 feet high. It was a dead-end hallway. And so we created an undulating dichroic film ceiling or false ceiling that would... this might blast out sound also. That the users or the visitors would explore using a headlamp. And so the patterns that would be shown on the wall when people moved through it kind of created a strange like cave-like feeling. And so we actually got to see people interacting with it and testing it in the real world, which helped integrate into my studio practice after that. So I was fortunate to have many classmates that shared my interest in these like ephemeral light-based qualities. And so that prompted Bill to actually create one of the only assignments that has ever existed in the Cranbrook architecture program, where he arranged to have SIPS panel boxes provided for us. So we were each given like a hermetic environment to tune and add to and subtract from for about a semester before our thesis show. So we each, addressed the box using our thesis research, and mine sought to bring in like many complex layers and kind of inundate the visitor with a really complex lighting situation. So this video shows a initial studio test of the wind strobe that I created, and I think this is a really good example of how our work exists in the studio, is tested, has to be tested at full scale, even if it's a small part of it, and then is integrated into the final design. And so this is kind of what that ended up being in the final. My intention with the wind strobes, there were 3 of these, was to completely strip the visitor of any control over what they were experiencing in the space, and also any ability to predict what they were going to experience. So it's kind of a really overwhelming experience that you just have to surrender to, and hopefully you want to surrender to. I can't meet the videos. And so, yeah, this is my thesis piece, basically.
Let's see if I can go to the next slide.
It's frozen?
Yeah. There it is.
So what we would talk about with Bill and the importance of having a full semester with these boxes is he would always talk about like tuning, because we were all really interested in these super specific perceptual tricks kind of. And so we had to, or we had the time to actually like hone that effect and hone that, the way that light was working for us. Yeah.
Cool. So I'll talk a little bit about my research, and then we'll talk about how our research has combined recently. So Cranbrook for me was very introspective, as it is for most people who go there. I had left an architectural career in New York and to go back to school, and so I was, yes, searching for a spatial practice, but I was also looking for some autonomy within the field of architecture. So I was trying to think about alternate ways of generating work and formulating a practice. So this is how I worked. I decided to build a custom sensory deprivation tank, or a float tank. And if you don't know what that is, it is a tank of water. It has 10 inches of water in it. It has 1,000 pounds of Epsom salt saturating the water. It's heated to the temperature of your skin, and there's no sound or light. You're so buoyant that you can actually sleep in the tank. So you have no sight, sound, or bodily awareness in a typical deprivation tank, or a chamber. So you sort of drift between conscious and unconscious states. You're in as minimal of an environment as is worldly possible, I guess. So it's not that I'm solely obsessed with sensory deprivation, although I think it's clear that I sort of am. But the float tank and then that sort of resulting reemergence back into the world offered an opportunity for experimentation and controlled research. So the tank itself was a research tool over which I was able to conduct a tool-based research practice. So I built this tank using both digital fabrication tools and a lot of manual labor. And then environment around it was also very highly controlled. So here's some shots of the construction process. I did a lot of plumbing. And so it was designed to be slightly different than a commercial tank in that it was not solely meant for deprivation, but it was a sort of open-ended space that could be altered and edited for experimentation. So it was a zeroed condition or a base over which I could layer a series of spatial apparatus. So after an hour in this tank floating in a darkened environment, potentially a warm rain would fall on your body, or a light fog or mist could fill the space, or repetitive sound, color, light, all sorts of combinations of things could happen or slowly start to change or affect your perception or experience of that space. So it became an example of tool-based research for me, and it allowed me to develop a method of testing, a sort of obsessive method of testing. So for 2 years, I was able to isolate sensory input and record the output of those resulting inputs. So I was cataloging everything that went into this tank, isolating certain sensory inputs, and then cataloging through video, photography, drawing, sound recording, and sort of qualitative writing. And so these are just some clips of some of that catalog, thousands of clips actually, it turns out. So I could sort of control even the slightest changes in sensory information in order to start to collect a set of data. So, and eventually they became a sort of spatial choreography where I could build upon the findings and start to layer different conditions over each other and experiment with sequencing or choreography, spatial choreography, I guess, so sort of testing space in a certain way. Let's see, I'll get through these. So, some more images of the tank. And it was constantly shifting and changing based on the things that I was finding out through this spatial practice. I have a lot of images in here. So drawing is also a big part of my practice, and Ingrid's. For me, it's a sort of way to get out aspirational or sort of atmospheric aspirations for the work. And so these were some images that were developed before the tank. And then as I started to have an output from the sensory input that I was putting into the actual work, I was able to take some of that and augment it and start to recontextualize it in a larger architectural context, but also starting to think about how this tool-based research could generate for future work. So here's some of the post documentation augmented imagery. And then all of this work was sort of compiled and cataloged mostly through video, and it was shown in a surrogate structure in the Museum of Art. And so it's built of SIPs, it's got a 70-inch flat screen TV in the top, and it acted as a sort of conceptual twin to the float tank in my studio. So there's this sort of unfettered experimentation, and then there's the compiled research that was playing through this surrogate structure. Okay, so now we can go on to our work together. Mm-hmm.
So one of the first things that we did together, like major things that we did together, was we taught a really experimental studio called Critical Practice at Lawrence Tech University. So it's a 10-week, 4-workshop charrette-style studio led by a master practitioner. In 2016, that was Tang, and we also did it in 2017, and it was Angie Co. And then there's a select number of fellows that lead the studios. We're supposed to treat it like a mini firm rather than a classroom. So we're supposed to organize the students in a way where they can like do a group project that's really refined and is the work that we want to push from it. So Bittertang's work is full of bodily associations. They're very interested in material studies, textures, pleasurable sensations. Their drawings, they have an extremely specific drawing style that is very focused on materiality and the way that forms are performing. So this is a process video that our students sent us as they were working on this very gelatinous and latex-based study that was a part of one of our projects in that class. These are some of the things that Bittertang was pushing, like how are these forms performing? What does it mean if they're flaccid? What does it mean if they're furry? What are these shapes implying in terms of how these things move, and maybe how old they are, and if they're sick or unwell. So these are things that we were kind of talking about, is like creating these forms based on these really specific material studies that we were doing, specifically with inflatables was kind of the push that they were working with.
Yeah, this is some of Bittertang's work, just to sort
this
of
is theirs, yeah.
Just to sort of show some examples of the way that they work materially and within their own drawing practice.
Right.
And then here's some of the resulting work from the studio. So it was primarily inflatable based. It was full scale, as material research typically is. And then it resulted in this very large inflatable creature that we hung in a warehouse in Detroit.
Right. So a lot of our struggles and interests with this were like, how do we make these forms specific when they're inflated? And so the way that we generated these forms came out of a number of tests of just creating quick forms and inflating them in order to figure out if they remain interesting when they're inflated or if they're distorted. So we've got puckering techniques, we have really elongated members, and so this thing on the side, that thing is like a balloon with water in it that's in a nylon sack. So we were actually mashing up different materials and forcing the students to create their own palette instead of just using plastic, in the same way that Heather was pushing us to think beyond plastic. So this is an indication of what that in-studio testing, fail fast, fail early system was really looking like. This is another process video that our students sent us of trying to get the squeezers to work. We wanted parts of this to be operable, where people could interact with it, squeeze things, hug things, and actually interact with this mega being that was above you.
And solely operating through drawing or digital modeling wouldn't have worked in this case, because the actual performative qualities of the forms, the materials were super important. So here's the final piece.
From the air. That's what it's called.
Yeah.
And so we would have never been able to generate this without a rigorous study of how inflatables actually work, and they had to become masters of dealing with this material.
Yeah, it's really a challenge.
And then we were able to figure out how to represent it and turn it into diagrams that would show assembly. But this is not the way that it was generated. This was generated from that work.
And then we taught another critical practices studio in 2017. Angie Ko was the master practitioner, and this is an image of her work. The studio is really talking about form finding through extrusion, so we used a lot of foam and hot wire cutting to extrude two-dimensional forms. And then we at SUBSTUDIO sort of really pushed an agenda which was about material exploration and the way that material can support or hinder the formal exploration that we were doing with our students. So an extremely iterative process of testing and, again, developing a palette of materials. And then beyond those, so, we're sort of going through foam cutting and surface exploration, and then casting and skeletal structures, sewing, things like that, painting. And then beyond that, starting to think about the way that the environment might support or be built off of those specific forms and materials that we were working with.
We also use video as a tool for kind of analyzing the success of environments inspired by the materiality of the objects. Mm-hmm. And so these were some of the camouflage related studies that we were doing.
Some earlier studies with the smaller forms, and then starting to get into some stop motion video with multiple players, a lot of texture, layering, and starting to think about if we could obscure or confuse the environment that these things exist within. Video than I thought it was. Cool. And then here's another study starting to think about the way that forms might interact with one another, the way they might combine.
And the way they move, too. Yeah. Some of them are rolling, some shuffle based on, I don't know. I mean, we were kind of encouraged to think of these as objects and then use them to inspire environments. That was kind of the structure of the studio. And so we tried to use materials as like a through line in order to make those more contiguous with each other. Mm-hmm.
And then drawing was really supporting that process of form finding and then environment creation around that. And then again, in a similar manner that we worked with Tang's prompts, we were trying to represent materiality in a really specific way. So, and then here are some of the final forms, which are full-scale details. So they made full-scale detail models because it's I guess a sort of difficult thing to represent materiality, and so working with it at full scale is important because then you start to understand the relationship that your body has to it, and the performative qualities of those materials. So this final detail shot is cut acrylic that's been painted and altered, that has dichroic film on it, and then there are some glycerin casts of the voids within there. So this project is one that we did this past fall. It was curated by the Unsolicited Sideshow as part of the Chicago Architecture Biennial. And so you're starting to hopefully see some artifacts of our past work and the way that that work is then generating for future projects. So sort of pulling from our catalog of spatial research and pushing it out into the world. And so these drawings are, again, speculative, they're atmospheric, and then they're generating a mood or politic for the work that we're thinking about making. And this is sort of thinking about that perceptual shifting and the body in space. And then as we actually got a site for the installation that we were going to do, we started to think about more site-specific rendering, but still evoking mood and politic. What's next? Yeah.
We pretty much immediately brought those ideas into the studio, and once we knew that we wanted to be implementing light catching devices, and used our studio tests to generate the forms and configurations of what we ended up calling this is the Joule. So it's kind of a bright focal point of the installation.
Yeah, so like really working in two different channels, which is representationally drawing and collage work, and then material-based practices to actually make some of that mood or atmosphere come to life in a space. Oh.
What?
I'm sorry.
It's kind of scary note.
Yeah, it's just glitching out because we have 800 videos in here.
Yeah.
And then we were also at the time working with an animator, Mark Governanti, to start to make some of our flat two-dimensional images dimensional and spatial as they might grow to be at a projection scale. So they might grow to be projected on the sides of a wall. And so the quality of the animation is starting to become spatial in and of itself. Here are some shots of the actual installation itself in the Chicago Athletic Association. It was just a one-night installation. And you want to talk about the musicians?
Yeah. So we knew that we wanted to have sound as an aspect of this. And so we collaborated with some musicians who put together an experimental what did they call it?
Ambient noise.
Yeah, but they did pop up. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Round robin is what they called it.
Oh yeah.
So it was Zohar Hussain, Jesse Olson, and Sarah Quillen who responded to the space in a really specific way that was really kind of brought it to the next level and allowed people to relax in the space and actually like sit down on these puddles that we'd created. It was really nice.
Yep. And it's nice to collaborate with people who are sort of experts in their own field that we can present something to, and you know, like even just placing something into a public realm is also an interesting act, especially because the way that we were generating work at Cranbrook was so isolated that placing it into a public realm is sort of a new realm for testing, and so it allows us to observe the work in a new context and then start to reconfigure the parts and pieces and fine-tune,
right.
Which is what we were so here's some videos of people interacting with the work and, you know, just being people in a hotel.
Yeah, people were really into their silhouettes.
And like selfies and things like that. Yeah.
That's pretty fun. I don't know.
Just know it.
Is it? Okay.
It'll stop, yeah.
So we were able to bring that work actually pretty quickly afterwards to a more relaxed environment in Cincinnati and collaborated with a number of folks to put together.
Where's that sound coming from? What the fuck? I don't know where it's coming from.
Let's just mute it on like a TV or something.
Will you mute that?
I think you have to pull it off the thing. Yes.
Yeah,
cool.
Thank you.
I don't know.
Okay, cool.
So that allowed us to kind of like see it in a different context. So we brought the Joule down there and the screens. We were able to recontextualize the work and deal with a different site and a different, less academicized environment. And we made a custom inflatable for it. It was a party. And the people that we were working with were working on music videos previously, so they have a totally different understanding of the way that they evaluate materials, and
the
they
social,
were super scrappy and experimental, and it was really fun for us to use their expertise as well and collaborate with them. This is a different collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, it's again talking about sort of taking the work into different contextual realms. This is a music video that we shot with an artist from Cincinnati,
Molly Sullivan,
and we actually shot it in the sensory deprivation tank at a very specific point of experimentation that was happening in it. And so it's just interesting to start to think about how the work can exist in like a video only realm or a social realm and parties, spaces. So here's just some images from that video, which hopefully will be released soon. And then again, all this social work is sort of setting us up for thinking about temporary or event-based work. So we're starting to work on a project for the Movement Festival, which is an electronic music festival in Detroit, and we're doing some creative direction for the stages and VIP areas. And so, you know,
this is going to be our catalog for developing that proposal.
Yeah, exactly. And then this is another image for a work that we're just starting to think about, which is reimagining or recontextualizing Diller Scafidio's work for their set design for the rotary notary and his hot plate. And so we're thinking about it in a contemporary light. This is a courtyard in Montpellier, France, and starting to think about a voyeuristic or body-centric stage-like installation.
Yeah. That's it.
That's it.